Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, today we will talk about rise of communal politics in the partition of India. And as we all are aware that the initial part of the 20th century and the kinds of policies which were followed by the British, specifically the divide and rule policy which they followed in the context of the colonial India, we find that how Hindus and Muslims, they created some kind of a wedge between them because of their communal policies, and because of which we find that how India got partitioned in 1947 at the time of independence. So in the course of our discussion, we will try to in a way talk about the kind of a background which was there with regard to the partition of India, how British played upon that kind of a politics with which they were trying to fen the kind of communal tendencies among the various political parties which were there in India, specifically the Muslim League, the establishment of Muslim League in 1906, and how Muslim League played an important role or a dominant role with regard to the partition of India, where we find that how the kind of slogans, the kind of politics which it in a way started with regard to demanding a separate state of Pakistan, and finally it led to the division of India. So we generally see that how British, they have been in a way seen in the framework of the divide and rule policy, and that has been attributed as one of the causes for India's partition. And when you talk about historiography, we also see that a number of historians, especially the nationalist historians, they have seen that how India got divided because of the British policies. And when we tend to see that the kind of communal harmony which was there in India in the earlier times, that got also damaged because of the policies which were followed by the British. And we see that how British in a way also encouraged Muslim League, and how the demand for Pakistan was supported by the British over a period of time. And when we tend to understand it in the framework of the various causes which were responsible for partition, we find that the 1930s and 1940s, the kind of politics which was there at that point of time, and the way the situation and the events they were unfolding. So all these factors, they definitely played an important role in the framework of the partition of India. And when you talk about that how Indian subcontinent got divided in the framework of India and Pakistan, and thereafter Bangladesh as well in 1971, we realize that the role of British, Muslim League and Indian National Congress, they have been taken into consideration by the various scholars. And many a times when we tend to understand partition, questions they have been raised with regard to partition of India, whether it was inevitable or it happened by sheer chance. So these kinds of aspects, they have also been discussed by the historians. Or when you talk about the various kinds of issues with regard to the partition of India, then we also find that it was not the fulfillment of any kind of a destiny which was there, or it was not the logical outcome of the two nation theory as well. And many times some scholars, those who have tried to understand partition, they have also argued that it was not an accident as well, which was produced by a single wrong decision or the failure of judgment. So in that context, when we tend to understand the events which were relating to 1930s and 40s, how the communal politics was being played during that time, how the mass mobilization with regard to the Muslim League also takes place, where they were demanding partition, and the Lahore resolution of 1940, it clearly talked about a separate state, and thereafter we find that Muslim League started mobilizing people in that, or the masses, in the framework of the partition. And we also see the 30s and the 40s, especially 1937 to 1947, that last kind of a decade in that sense before the Indian independence. And political developments, they were happening at a very faster pace, and we find that a number of underlying differences in the levels of the economic and social development of the Hindus and the Muslim communities of that particular time, they also played an important role. And we find that when we turn to the kind of a background which was there with regard to the partition of India, how British, they always tried to create a wedge between these communities and others as well, that how the issue of separate electorates was given the support by the British when the Muslim League demanded it in 1909, and it was one of the major divisive forces or moves that vitiated the political culture of India until independence in 1947. And we also see, when you talk about what all was happening with regard to the emergence of the Muslim League, and some scholars, they have talked about that how the Muslim League deputation to the Viceroy in 1906 itself was a command performance in that sense, and how League was set up by an elite group, those who were trying to in a way promote their own interests at the expense of the interests of the masses. And later we also see that how British, they also extended it to the Sikhs as well. So we find that British, they realized that they will be able to control Indians in a far better manner when they will be divided, as had happened in the case of the 1857 revolt as well, where we find that the people, those who supported the British, whether the zamindars or the some princely states and other factions, so they realized that how the British, how the Indians, they had to be kept divided by them, and then only they will be able to achieve their objectives of ruling India for a longer period of time. And we also find that through the Ramsay MacDonald Award, how the British, they wanted to in a way provide the separate electorates to the depressed classes as well. And through the Pune Pact between Ambedkar and Gandhi, we realize that such kind of a wedge could not be created, how we find that more seats, they were being given to the depressed classes through some kind of a compromise through the Pune Pact. And we also see that British, in a way, they whether you find various scholars, those who have been anthropologists, and they have argued that how British classified or their classification practices, they were encouraging the representation as well as the self-representation of the Indians according to the caste and religion. And they were listing various castes and communities in India, and they also counted them in that sense. So when you talk about the census, when you talk about the surveys which were being encouraging the ideas of the enumerated communities at that time, and it was also trying to in a way create the concept of the majority and minority in different parts of the country. And British, they were trying to do it so that this kind of an identity question becomes dominant among the different sections of the society. And when this kind of issue will be prominent in the people, then they will be able to create some kind of differences among them. And when they will not be united, then they will not fight against the colonial rule. And when you talk about the scholars, we find that they have also seen in that particular framework that how identities, they were being in a way replaced, the fuzzy identities which were there, they were being replaced by the hard and singular identities at that point of time. And in a way it forced the groups with the complex and multiple identities to choose one. So British Orientalist scholarship, it played an important role in the development of the ideas about the peculiarities of Indian society, and scholars like Bernard Cohn, Appudurai and Kaviraj, they have tried to in a way understand these kinds of ideas, because more and more identities which were to be created by the British, then that would mean that people are more divided in that sense. And various methods which were being used by them, whether in the framework of the surveys or in the framework of the various kinds of census, which were being done by them. All of them, they were trying to create from the fuzzy identities, they were trying to create some kind of fixed identities, and generally they felt that only one kind of an identity should be adopted by one community. And we also realize during this time, when you talk about the codification of laws of Hindus and how it led to the freezing of the dynamic nature of the traditional society and culture, and valorized a primarily textual and elitist upper caste conception of Hindu law and practices. So, various kinds of laws which were prevalent in the society, and especially when you talk about the codification of these laws, especially the Hindu laws which were being done at that point of time, we realize that such kind of codification was also in a way done in a very deliberate kind of manner at that point of time by the British, so that those laws they could, though they were being practiced by the upper caste Hindus of those times, but they could be attributed to, in a way, everyone. And it also happened in the framework of the Muslim laws when they were being codified, and how it led to the rigid interpretation of the law and reduced the role of the interpretation that had been important in the Muslim jurisprudence. And we also realize when one is talking about writing history, it also played an important role in that sense, that how the ideas of community soon became the common kind of sense over a period of time. So, the way British they wrote history from a Eurocentric point of view with a colonial mindset, it was always in such kind of a manner that how they could, in a way, divide the Indians, and that was one of their main mottos, because that is how they were going to survive in India. And when you talk about this kind of a colonial construction of the notion of community, it grew more and more elaborate with time and the introduction of the representative government and separate electorates. We find that it gave the government a lot of opportunity to heighten this process of community formation, and that was one of the issues with regard to India, because then when you talk about the issue of identity, then we find that the logic of competition then took over, and the stronger notions of the boundaries of the community developed by the early 20th century. And we find that British in a way wanted to remain in India for a very long period of time. That was their main objective, because India was one country where they were not able to secure a lot of wealth or money, but the kind of resources which were available in India, they were numerous and immense, and British they did not want to lose India. And that is how we find that they encouraged Muslim League after 1940 to weaken the national movement as well. And we also find that whenever Congress was participating in the government during the war, British that also did not like that, also they wanted to threaten that kind of a situation as well. And some of the scholars they have even talked about that British they were not ready to only offer partition to India, but they many times also were contemplating the balkanization of India as well, where India would be divided into so many states, countries. So that was one of their objectives, and we find that when you talk about the role of Muslim League with regard to the partition, then how Muslim League members, especially how it was being mobilized during the times of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, as well as how Jinnah was inspired by Muhammad Iqbal, and how both of them they collaborated as well, and how he played an important role in the partition process as well. And we see that other nationalist historians they have in a way argued that how Jinnah was alienated by a transformation of the Congress, and when Gandhi becomes more prominent in the Congress politics, especially after 1917 and 1919 and 1920, when we find that the Rowlatt Satyagraha began, and how the non-cooperation movement was one of the major movements during Gandhi. And during this particular period, when Gandhi became more prominent, then Jinnah in a way lost his own relevance in the national politics of that time. And we find that over a period of time Jinnah became hostile towards Congress and became some kind of an enemy of the Congress, and over a period of time he also assumed the leadership of Muslim League. And we when we talk about Jinnah, we also find that the way he operated, he wanted to, though he was never in the framework of the kind of ideas which he had initially when he joined Congress. Over a period of time there was a transformation in those ideas, and we find that he also opposed the Nehru Report of 1928, which advocated a unitary form of government and the representation of minorities based on the numerical importance in the different regions. And we find that the poor performance of the Muslim League in the elections of 1937, which were happening in the provincial assemblies, that compelled him to rethink his strategy. And when we find that it was the rejection of a coalition government with the League in UP by Congress after farmers' poor showing in elections led to a strong reaction from the League as well. And we find that how Muslim League was critical of the Congress ministries, and how Muslim League was decided to reject the notion that Muslims could live as a minority under Hindu Congress domination. So in a way Jinnah accused that how Congress was a Hindu body, and in 1940 League declared the right of self-determination of the Muslim majorities in northwest and east of India. So we find that over a period of time Jinnah became more and more vocal in his demands, as well as we find that he became more and more critical of the Congress as well. And when you talk about the elections of the 1937, for example, where League was not successful, then Jinnah devised new kinds of strategies to make League a potent force. And we find that when you talk about the elections during that time, then League won only 109 out of the 492 reserved Muslim seats, and only 4.8% of the total Muslim votes. So these kinds of results discouraged League in that sense, and at the same time it also motivated the League that how it has to expand the popular base among the different sections of the Muslim population, particularly among the urban lower middle classes as well. So we find that they started some kind of a new program which was dealing with the socio-economic and political programs, and this was one of their main idea to achieve their purpose, because they felt that the existing social base of the League was among the landlords and the loyalist elements only. So they had to in a way increase the base or the social base of the League which was there. They had to widen that particular base. More and more people, they had to be incorporated in that base. And League also in a way talked about the ideas, or it talked about the ideas of Islam in danger and the threat of impending Hindu Raj. So this kind of a cry was raised by the Muslim League, that how they had to live in a Hindu dominated state, and Congress was a party which was favoring the Hindus. And they in a way talked about that how they had to save their religion from the kind of threats which were there. And this kind of an approach, where such kind of slogans they were being raised about some kind of a danger to the religion, they over a period of time turned into a campaign of hatred against the followers of other religion. And we find that how Jinnah and Iqbal, both of them, they collaborated as well, and how they were in touch, regular touch, when they were in London. And we find that in the roundtable conference deliberations, Iqbal had also participated, and he calculated Jinnah's demand for increased communal representation as highly insufficient for Muslims in the long run. So we see that such kind of ideas which were there at that point of time, which was talking about the issue of identity, which was talking about the issue of more representation for different communities, they were also there. And Hector Bolitho, one of the scholars, has argued that in 1930 Iqbal declared that very conception of a homogeneous India would drive country to a civil war, and the only solution being the partition of the land. And he proposed the amalgamation of Punjab, Northwest Frontier Province, Sindh and Balochistan into a single state. So, we find that such kind of ideas which were being in a way generated, which were being circulated by some of the people, those who wanted a separate homeland for themselves, and Iqbal being one of them. And the ideas of Iqbal, they were understood by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and he tried to carry forward those kinds of ideas with the kind of action in which he involved himself. And we also see that other scholars, they have also seen that during the round table conference, with the third round table conference for example, Iqbal also stated that Muslims were against a central government, since it was bound to be dominated by the Hindus. So, B.R. Danda has talked about that how Iqbal stated this kind of an argument, and so such kinds of arguments, they were in a way circulating at that point of time, and people like Iqbal, those one who wrote Sare Jahan Se Achha, at one point of time also turned into more and more communal, and his ideas with regard to creation of a separate state for the Muslims, they had definitely a strong impact on Jinnah and the Muslim League, and they carried on from these kinds of ideas which were being propagated by such kind of thinkers. And we also see that when Jinnah and Iqbal, they were collaborating, V. N. Datta has argued that Iqbal had all along bestowed a strong faith in Jinnah's leadership for the Muslim community. And in 1937 elections, when Muslim League was not able to secure good results, he advised Jinnah to counter Nehru's idea of aesthetic socialism by proposing that the problems of Muslims were cultural and not economic. So, we find that some kind of a twist was also being done by these scholars, those who talked about the economic, those who did not want to talk about the economic backwardness of the Muslims and the kind of problems which were there in the Muslim community, they were being given in the framework of more cultural in nature. And Iqbal, for that matter, definitely had that kind of a faith in Jinnah, and he reposed that kind of a faith, and we find that Jinnah also acknowledges the kind of conversation which he had with Iqbal. And Jinnah himself, for that matter, he found some kind of consolation, some kind of optimism in the kind of suggestions which were given by Iqbal, and we find that both of them, they met as well in May 1937, where they deliberated on certain aspects which were relating to what had to be done during that point of time with regard to the issue of having a separate state for themselves. And we also see that when they were collaborating with each other, Iqbal wrote to Jinnah that the time for seeking the redistribution of the country leading to the birth of one or more states with a Muslim majority as only solution to the communal logjam which had already arrived. So, we find that scholars like Bolitho have talked about this kind of aspect, and how that kind of a political scenario of 1930s and 1940s it led to the partition of India. So, we will discuss further some of the aspects which are relating to the communal politics in our next lecture. Thank you very much.